This is INCA TV now. I'm pleased to be joined by Charles Cameron of Cameron Barney. Charles, thank you for joining me today. Now, I've heard you talk today about investment at the Investor Workshop. How difficult is it for getting investment for the altnets?
Well, it's a good question. It has been difficult in the past, and it's certainly a lot easier today. What we found is over the last few years, partly by virtue of initiatives from government, but also by initiatives from private investors, that the whole idea of investing in early stage infrastructure and the fact that that can be economically attractive is high on the radar now for institutional investors. So 2 or 3 years ago, hard to get institutional investors interested in early stage infrastructure for altnets. Today, pretty easy, actually. And although I make a living out of advising clients on how difficult it is, I must confess it's become a lot easier. And it's become easier for 2 reasons. One, there's much more familiarity with the business models. 2, there are plenty of examples of companies actually making money, and therefore investors are more comfortable that the risks are not as high as they previously presumed. And 3rd, I think it's become evident that actually BT doesn't and cannot necessarily outcompete small companies, because a crew putting in a fibre for BT is no faster than a crew putting in a fibre for an altnet. So I think there's a number of features that have made it easier. Mostly it's an appreciation of the risks that have been proved.
And also some people talk about, they mentioned it today, it's cheap money.
Yes, I think that's an interesting term, and I think it's one I've used myself. But what I mean by cheap is, in the sense, is that it's much less dilutive to you as an owner of your company than it was 3 or 4 years ago. In other words, the valuations of businesses have risen, and with that, the leverage that you as an altnet would now have versus the provider of money. 3+ years ago, your leverage versus the money was lower. It's now higher. So in that sense, you can get a better bargain.
But I also heard you talk about values of some of these companies. Once they've started operating, the values go sky high. Is that something that we're going to continue with in the future?
Well, I think values need to be looked at quite carefully. Yes, I think there is a sense that values have risen, and there's no doubt that some of the acquisitions that we have seen, when looked against normal or ordinary market multiples or multiples of profitability and so forth, they do look quite expensive, some of these transactions. So yes, I think there's a feeling that values have risen. At the same time, though, it's still quite early in the life cycle of these businesses to see whether these values are high or not. And ultimately, these are all long-term infrastructure investments. And actually, whether the value is high today, it may just be somewhere on the road that we're seeing a blip, but over time, maybe those values will return to some form of norm. Ultimately, this is an infrastructure investment, will probably generate single-digit returns for long-term institutions, but in the early days, investors do look for higher returns than that. I think valuations are high-ish at the moment. That's partly a function of more money chasing fewer opportunities.
Now, finally, it's an unusual political landscape we find ourselves in the UK. Is that having an effect on investors?
I think it's having some effect. So I think that global funds that have a chance to think about whether they put their money to work in the UK or in Germany or in Australia or North America, they can choose, not the UK right now. If you're a UK fund, that choice isn't available to you, and therefore you are in the UK. So there is a sufficient amount of money, I think, that's dedicated to the UK to make the current political position not overly problematic. And because these are long-term investments that everyone is considering, Brexit, which I think is what you're largely referring to, is a short-term issue. Of course, it causes issues for operators. It may impact the resourcing, it may impact costs of imported goods, and of course regulatory uncertainty has an impact on price. But over the lifetime of an investment in infrastructure holding, those are short-term.
Charles, thank you very much.
Pleasure.